old stones piled up beside a big ditch, scattered rocks in the bottom of a river, huge wooden timbers in the bottom of a creek, stark abutments along the river's banks, a big ditch that winds for miles across Indiana along the rivers, beside railroads and highways, sometimes holding an inch or two of water, mostly dry. These are the ruins of Indiana's 19th century canal system. Once these were busy thoroughfares carrying the lifeblood of a young nation and shaping the future of Indiana. Now, more than 150 years old, silent and overgrown, they have become a part of our landscape. Just as the canals themselves have made enduring marks on the Indiana landscape, they have had deep and lasting effects on the social and economic structures of the state. This is their story. When the first French explorers reached Indiana around 1680, they followed the trails which had been used for centuries by the Native American peoples as they carried on their own trading, traveling, and exploring. The many rivers of Indiana form an intricate network of waterways that could be used for travel to almost any part of the state. The early explorers learned that there were certain places where parts of two rivers lay so close together that it was possible to carry the boats from one river to another, and thus proceed for many miles. The Frenchmen called such a place a portage, which means carrying place. Now, we usually say portage. One of the most useful portages connected the Maumee River, which flows eastward to Lake Erie, and the Little River, a tributary of the Wabash, which joins the Ohio. The divide between the Maumee and Wabash rivers is very low, carved by meltwater from the glaciers of 12,000 years ago. This Maumee-Wabash Trough, as it is called, was once the bed of a gigantic river that followed the routes of the present-day Wabash and Ohio rivers into the great Mississippi Basin. With the Maumee flowing toward Lake Erie and the Little River flowing to the Wabash, a nearly level area remained between the two rivers where the water did not flow, but lay stagnant in a great marshy area known as the Portage Marsh. Along the north edge of this marsh ran a trail where the travelers carried and dragged their boats and their goods. This 7-mile portage was the only break in a continuous water route between the French settlements of Quebec and Montreal in Canada, and the important seaport of New Orleans in French Louisiana. The route through the interior of the continent was especially important to the French, who also hoped to establish a military presence in the interior regions, strengthening their hold on the land. As they slogged through the mud of the portage trail, many travelers must have had the idea that a ditch or canal could be dug through this soggy place. In the Ordinance of 1787, the United States reserved this portage for its citizens as a common highway to be used without any taxes, imposts, or duty, thus establishing its importance as a national roadway. President Washington recognized the importance of good transportation routes, and in a letter to Jacob Reed, dated November 3, 1784, he wrote, "Extend the inland navigation of the eastern waters, communicate them as near as possible by excellent roads, with those which run to the westward. Open these to the Ohio and such others as extend from Ohio towards Lake Erie, and we shall not only draw the produce of the western settlers, but the fur and peltry trades of the lakes also to our ports, to the amazing increase of our exports, while we bind these people to a chain which can never be broken." The evacuation by the British of their forts in the Northwest Territory by 1796 had permitted the young nation to secure its hold on the upper Ohio Valley, and the experiences of the United States in the War of 1812 showed the necessity of adequate transportation in military operations in the West. Captain McAfee, in 1816, writing in his History of the War of 1812, said,
"The Maumee is navigable from this place to the lake, and the portage to the nearest navigable branch of the Wabash is but 7 or 8 miles through a level, marshy prairie from which the water runs both to the Wabash and to the St. Mary's. A canal at some future day will unite these rivers."
The first real efforts at canal building in Indiana took place along the Ohio River at New Albany and Jeffersonville. Here, the Ohio River rushed over a submerged limestone ledge in 2 miles of rapids. Judge James Hall, who saw the rapids at close hand, wrote,
"The ear is stunned with the sound of rushing waters, and the sight of waves dashing and foaming and whirling among the rocks and eddies below is grand and fearful."
As settlement continued, the Ohio became an important river of commerce, carrying not only the canoes and pirogues of the Indians and early traders, but now the flatboats and keelboats of an increasing commerce. The thought of building a canal along the falls of the Ohio must also have occurred to many travelers. In 1805, the Indiana Canal Company was chartered to build a canal around the Ohio Falls. A series of unsuccessful efforts were made, but a canal around the falls was not completed until 1831, on the Kentucky side of the river. The idea of using canals to take boats around impassable sections of rivers, or as water highways, was not a new one. In 1681, the Canal du Midi was opened in France, connecting the Atlantic Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea. It brought new commerce and prosperity to the previously isolated interior regions which it crossed. In England, it was the demand for coal as fuel for the growing industrial revolution that inspired the beginnings of the canal era. In 1761, the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal was opened, connecting the Duke's coal mines at Worsley with the city of Manchester. There, the coal was sold in great quantities, at a much lower price to the public, and at much greater profits to the Duke. Other businessmen were quick to notice. By 1800, there were nearly 700 miles of artificial waterways in operation in Great Britain, as well as many more miles throughout Europe. In North America, the United States looked westward to a vast and fertile continent, a whole new world of land, waiting to be taken and used. To the east, across the Atlantic, were millions of overcrowded, land-hungry people. From all around, jealous rivals grasped at the western country. The dangers were great. The opportunities were stupendous. No one understood these things better than Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson. In 1808, in his famous Report on Roads and Canals, Gallatin wrote,
"The inconveniences, complaints, and perhaps dangers, which may result from a vast extent of territory, cannot otherwise be radically removed or prevented than by opening speedy and easy communication through all its parts. Good roads and canals will shorten distances, facilitate commercial and personal intercourse, and unite by a still more intimate community of interests the most remote quarters of the United States. No other single operation within the power of government can more effectually tend to strengthen and perpetuate that union which secures external independence, domestic peace, and internal liberty."
Gallatin contended that the greatest benefit would come from a unified system of transportation routes, rather than from unconnected routes. He also felt that the federal government alone was capable of such grand undertakings. Although the basic wisdom of Gallatin's program was generally recognized, there was much opposition to it, and it was never actually carried out. Many Americans distrusted a strong central government, and felt that internal improvements should be financed by the states through which they passed. It was also believed that the Constitution did not permit federally financed public works projects. The campaign for federally funded internal improvements was long and complex. Most popular of these proposals was the American system, advocated by Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and John Quincy Adams. This system called for a series of roads and canals connecting all parts of the country. The American system was never constructed, but the national road from the eastern seaboard to the western country, already underway, became a reality. The project that was to fire the imagination of the western states, touching off the canal era in America, was the Grand Canal of New York, better known as the Erie Canal. Opened in 1825, the Erie Canal of New York had proved successful beyond even the wildest hopes of its creators. The canal had brought great prosperity to the state of New York, sending New York City well on its way toward becoming the nation's primary seaport. Also, the Erie Canal offered great benefits to the regions bordering the Great Lakes, allowing easy transportation to the bustling markets of the eastern seaboard. In the 1820s, Pennsylvania had begun work on an extensive system of railroads and waterways, partly as a result of competition between the cities of Philadelphia and New York. In 1825, the state of Ohio had begun construction on its own internal improvement system, including 2 canals to connect the Ohio River with Lake Erie. Indiana congressmen lobbied long and hard for a canal to connect the Maumee and Wabash rivers, arguing that such a canal would not only benefit the trade of Indiana, but that it would greatly extend the markets of the eastern cities, especially New York. In 1827, they were rewarded by the passage of a bill which, for the first time anywhere, granted federal land to the state of Indiana for a canal. The land was to be sold, and the proceeds were to finance construction of a Wabash-Erie Canal.